My name is Jens Zimmermann, Professor of Theology and Director of the Houston Center here at Regent College. Regent is a theological graduate school affiliated with the University of British Columbia. And the Houston Center fosters interdisciplinary and interreligious dialogue on the central question of the late modern world: what does it mean to be human? This question is obviously of central importance because what we desire and how we act depends always explicitly or implicitly on who we think we are. Hence, at the Houston Center, we explore the conceptions of human identity that underlie our current social and political practices. We cannot talk about the common good of society without an implicit understanding of what kind of beings we are. And tonight, our guest, Professor Gilbert Meilaender, will address a fundamental topic that fits right into our mandate, perhaps the fundamental topic, underlying especially Western ideals of human identity and society, namely the concept of human dignity. The notion that every person possesses an inviolable dignity is therefore irreplaceable and deserves our respectful recognition lies at the heart of so many things that we used to take for granted. For example, education and the search for truth through dialogue that used to be the hallmark of public universities is based on human dignity. Proper political discourse, democracy, including human rights and freedoms, are based on human dignity. And equally important, medical ethics and healthcare, which are fundamentally based on a patient's consent to treatment and how we view the person, are based on human dignity. I think it may be the experience of many here tonight that human dignity is no longer held in very high esteem. We see it in political discourse, we see it in government actions. At the very least, even when we demand that our dignity be respected, our freedoms acknowledged, and our rights granted, we seem to have lost the common ground on which human dignity is based. What better time than to attend a lecture entitled Equal Dignity in Search of a Rationale? And what better speaker to address us tonight than Professor Gilbert Meilaender, who has spent a lifetime thinking about these issues. Professor Meilaender is a senior research professor at Valparaiso University. He taught at the University of Virginia, at Oberlin College, and at Valparaiso University until 2014, where he held the Duesenberg Chair in Christian Ethics. He holds an MDiv from Concordia University and a PhD from Princeton. He is the author of many books. Some of you here in the audience have used his works when teaching, drawing on them when teaching bioethics. So many books and articles in the field of Christian ethics. Among his books are Friendship, a study in theological ethics. Another title is Bioethics, a primer for Christians. Another one, The Way That Leads There, Augustinian Reflections on the Christian Life. And then an edited volume of readings entitled Working and Meaning and Its Limits. And he's also co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Theological Ethics. So as you can see, a pretty impressive resume on the topic. He has served on the board of directors of the Society of Christian Ethics as an associate editor of Religious Studies Review, as a consultant, and so on and so forth. Professor Meilander's work is well known, and he was a fellow of the Hastings Center, and he was also a member of the President's Ethics Council, Bioethics Council, from 2002 to 2009. And so we're very grateful that you're here, and we invite you to speak on the topic at hand. Please help me welcome Professor Meilaender.
Thank you, Jens. If you're not hearing me, you need to signal, okay? Or if I start to mumble at some point, you need to signal. I'm very happy to be here. It's sort of a special pleasure to be introduced by someone who actually knows how to pronounce the name Meilaender. not Meilaender, or any of those other things that it gets made. So I appreciate that. And my father would appreciate it as well. And my grandfather would appreciate it. But anyway, I'm pleased to be here and hope that what I have to say about this topic will be useful. It is as important a topic as Jens said in his introduction. And I'll try to sort of make clear as we go along where the direction in which the talk is moving when I take up different things. There is no single concept of dignity upon which people in our society are generally agreed. And to complicate matters even more, the word is often used in diametrically opposed ways in our public discussions. So, for example, death with dignity has become a slogan used in support of euthanasia and assisted suicide. A person whose physical and mental capacities are in decline and greatly diminished, who is almost entirely dependent on others for intimate care, such a person might, at some point, prefer death to continued life thought to be lacking in dignity, and that's probably the way we'd put it. By contrast, someone else might argue that physical decline and dependence before death are simply part of the human condition, and that living through such dependence toward death is in no way undignified. On the contrary, doing so might even be said to bear witness to the dignity of every person's life, whatever its state or condition. Now, when the same term can be used to articulate such opposing views, we should not suppose that our task is to figure out what the word really means. It's just a contested term, and we have to realize that. Rather, ours is something a little more like what we might call a normative task. We have to try to explain what we mean when we use the term and try to offer, as best we can, a rationale for doing so, and then see if that rationale makes sense to anybody else. I'm going to suggest that the term dignity is properly used in at least two important ways, and that the more important of these, but also the more puzzling of these, is to mark the equal personal dignity that we all share. It's not the only meaning, however. There will be another meaning as well, but that, I think, is fundamental. And it may be useful at the outset simply to try to illustrate something about what I mean by that equal personal dignity that we all share. And I want to do it with a passage. It's not a passage that actually uses dignity language at all, but it's a passage from G.K. Chesterton in which, in his own inimitable way, he makes a point, something like that. And he's writing of what he calls a certain instinctive attitude which feels that the things in which all men agree to be unspeakably important, and the things in which they differ, such as mere brains, to be almost unspeakably unimportant. The nearest approach to it in our ordinary life would be the promptitude with which we should consider mere humanity in any circumstance of shock or death. We should say, after a somewhat disturbing discovery, "There's a dead man under the sofa." We would not be likely to say, "There's a dead man of considerable personal refinement under the sofa." We should say, "A woman has fallen into the water." We should not say, "A highly educated woman has fallen into the water." Nobody would say, "There are the remains of a clear thinker in your back garden." Nobody would say, "Unless you hurry up and stop him, a man with a very fine ear for music will have jumped off that cliff." You've heard the high point of this talk now, by the way. Sort of all, the trajectory is all downhill after Chesterton. But it is, I think, no accident, I will eventually return to this point. It's no accident that Chesterton illustrates his point using examples of those who have died. For at death, more than anywhere else, a kind of on the whole sense about the significance of a person's life is in order. And in that moment and at that judgment, the many ways in which we differ, which are so important in much of life, those ways seem to fall away at that point. For in death, one of us, one equal in dignity to each of us, one who cannot be replaced by any other, is no more. and all the ordinary distinctions in merit and excellence that are so important throughout life in our relations with each other, all those distinctions pale beside the fact that we are equidistant from God. Eternity never counts, as Kierkegaard says. Thus, in relation to God, all distinctions are radically relativized, and we can even say, Kierkegaard again, all comparison injures. And our inability in the end to compare persons invites us to recognize their equality. As the philosopher John Crosby has put it, by being unrepeatable, persons are incommensurable with each other. They cannot be compared with each other, and because of this, a certain equality is established among them. Suppose then we say that someone has dignity or displays dignity. We could mean by this, one thing we could mean is that he is an especially distinguished person, distinguished by some sort of excellence that sets him off from the rest of us. Or, remembering Chesterton's illustration of the kind of on-the-whole judgments we make, especially in the face of death, we could mean that in this person we recognize the dignity that belongs unrepeatably and equally to each of us. And what I want to try to do is sort of sort out those two meanings, and insofar as I can do it, the relation between them. So let's start by just thinking about these two kinds of dignity. From one perspective, human beings are members of a species that is distinguished from other species by certain characteristics. Human beings are sort of strange, in-between kinds of creatures, lower than angels or God, higher than the other animals. So St. Augustine writes in a sentence that sort of succinctly captures the point, God created man's nature as a kind of mean between angels and beasts. So human beings display certain characteristics of body, mind, and spirit that make them different, that set them off from the other animals. I'm going to refer to this as our human dignity. I mean, you could think of various words. That's that kind of dignity I'm going to call human dignity, the characteristics that distinguish our species, the human species. We should not ignore that human dignity. On the contrary, we should honor it. And we honor it by trying to be neither more than human, as if we were angels or gods, nor less than human, as if our nature were no different from that of the other animals. Now, of course, none of these other natures is a bad thing in itself. An animal is not a bad thing, and I presume that an angel is not a bad thing. I haven't got a lot of experience on that one, but I think not. But we are neither of those, and human dignity is to be found in the kind of life that honors and upholds the particular nature that is ours, even if there is no recipe book that can tell us always exactly how to live as the complex beings that human beings are. At other times, however, when we use the language of dignity, we mean something that is different, I think. That's what I will call personal dignity, though again, that's just the term that I'm giving to it. This is roughly the kind of notion that I think Chesterton was illustrating. Sometimes we want to emphasize in particular the equal and incommensurable standing of each individual person. And that equal personal dignity, if it really does exist, and I understand that it will be questioned by some, but that equal personal dignity, if it exists, cannot be grounded in any of those particular characteristics that distinguish human beings from the other animal species. For those characteristics we possess unequally, in greater or lesser degree. And yet we are committed, or at least many of us are still committed, to a belief in an equal personal dignity, even if the ground of that sometimes seems a little obscure. And a simple illustration will demonstrate, at least I think demonstrates, that these two concepts of dignity really are different, both important, but different. I might say that chattel slavery, buying and selling another human being, degrades and dehumanizes the slave, depriving him of his dignity. I might also say that nothing you can do to a person, including enslaving him, can deprive him of his dignity. And you can even imagine somebody giving a talk about slavery and making both of those statements in fairly close proximity to each other. I don't think such a person would be contradicting himself or confused. I don't think so. Could it not be that, on the one hand, slavery fails to respect the human dignity of the slave, and yet on the other hand is utterly unable to deprive him of his personal dignity. That at least is sort of the way I would sort it out. So on the one hand, the language of dignity serves as what we might think of as a placeholder for a complex vision of what it means to be human, a humanity that is understood correctly only if we think of human beings in certain kinds of ways, a humanity that will be lost if we think of the human being as a kind of animated commodity that might be owned by another human being. And on the other hand, the language of dignity also affirms that we would be wrong to suppose that that among two people equally made for life with God, one could be the owner of the other. So we can coherently, I think we could coherently object to slavery, both on the ground that it deprives the slave of his human dignity and on the ground that it fails to recognize the personal dignity that cannot be lost even by one who is enslaved. So the human person is a member of our species that has a nature, a range of special characteristics. But a person is not just a something, not just a bearer of those traits. He or she is also a someone who occupies a unique place that transcends species membership. And there is what I think, at any rate, is a nice illustration of this in a passage from George Orwell. It's from a very early Orwell essay called A Hanging. It's not, I think, one of Orwell's most famous essays, but you may know that as a young man, Orwell had served in the Indian Imperial Police in Burma, and it was there that he witnessed an execution that he writes about in this essay. And he, in the setting, he describes the man who is about to be hanged being walked to the gallows, and as he makes his way there is a puddle in front of him, and he very carefully steps around the puddle on his way to the gallows. And then Orwell writes this: "It is curious, but till that moment I had never realized what it means to destroy a healthy, conscious man. When I saw the prisoner step aside to avoid the puddle, I saw the mystery, the unspeakable wrongness of cutting a life short when it is in full tide. This man was not dying, he was alive just as we were alive. All the organs of his body were working, bowels digesting food, skin renewing itself, nails growing, tissues forming, all toiling away in solemn foolery. His nails would still be growing when he stood on the drop, when he was falling through the air with 1/10 of a second to live. His eyes saw the yellow gravel and the gray walls, and his brain still remembered, foresaw, reasoned even about puddles. He and we were a party of men walking together, seeing, hearing, feeling, understanding the same world, and in 2 minutes, with a sudden snap, one of us would be gone, one mind less, one world less." And it's that last line that especially interests me. In 2 minutes, one of us would be gone, one mind less, one world less. Each person is a world, not just an instance of some more general kind humanity, but an unrepeatable and incommunicable world, a kind of inwardness, a mystery, Orwell calls it. So person and nature are different categories, and who we are is not simply interchangeable with what we are. Persons, therefore, are marked by a kind of inwardness and inner distance from their own self, from their own states. A stone falls through the air and is simply an object controlled by laws of nature. I fall through the air from a building and I know myself as a falling object, which means that I both am and am not that object. I both am and am distanced from it. And in the uniqueness of that someone lies our personal dignity. And it is rather mysterious. It's not surprising that people find it mysterious. It's mysterious in a way that the dignity of the human species, that human dignity, is not so mysterious. But if we're interested in that equal personal dignity, what we have then, and if we're committed to it, what we have then is what I call a commitment in search of a rationale. If we have this commitment, it would be nice if we had a rationale for it. Now, perhaps ironically, as commitment to the notion of equal personal dignity became more widely shared in our world, in recent times. At the same time, a possible religious ground for that dignity has become, at least in the minds of many people, less obvious, less believable. So the commitment remains, at least for many of us, not for everybody, but for many of us, but the rationale for the commitment seems obscure. We're not sure what it might be. In the late 1940s, in the process of preparing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UNESCO convened a committee of philosophers, which is probably always a bad idea, but UNESCO convened a committee of philosophers to examine the theoretical bases for universal claims about human dignity and rights. And while the philosophers were able to agree on many particular claims about human dignity, they were, perhaps unsurprisingly, unable to agree on why those claims were true. Unable, that is, to develop some kind of rationale, some kind of shared vision of human nature or the human person on the basis of which such claims could be made. And Jacques Maritain, who was one of the participating philosophers, later recounted how, as he wrote, at one of the meetings of a UNESCO National Commission where human rights were being discussed, someone expressed astonishment that certain champions of violently opposed ideologies had agreed on the list of those rights. Yes, they said, we agree about the rights, but on condition that no one asks us why, which is probably about where we are today. I suspect that we're just as uncertain, still in search of a rationale that can undergird our commitment to equal dignity. And when the view that I think once provided, at least for many, many people, this rationale, the view that grounds personal dignity in our relation to God, when that view begins to recede in the public mind, then the theoretical case for equal dignity must be made, if it can be made, on other grounds. There are, I think, in our contemporary culture, there are roughly two ways we've tried to do this, to find another usable but non-religious ground. And those two ways grow out of what are the two moral stances that really seem to appeal to many people in our world. On the one hand, a commitment to freedom and choice, and on the other hand, a commitment to compassion and relief of suffering. The first of those ways, commitment to freedom of choice, roughly Kantian in nature, focuses on the freedom to choose for ourselves a way of life and then prescribe for ourselves rules that will govern it. And that kind of being a being with that kind of freedom is thought to be the ground of our dignity. In a sense, we become what you might think of as an isolated principle of will, rather abstracted from bodily life. That's not what's crucial here. And this notion of autonomy may become so abstract that it really at some point fails to help us understand dignity. There's a well-known case that has been mentioned often in the literature, a French case involving dwarf throwing that was used to demonstrate the problem. At issue was whether dwarf tossing, as it was called, in bars, for instance, whether dwarf tossing was an acceptable form of public entertainment, whether we could all stand around and kind of laugh and enjoy dwarfs being tossed back and forth. And on the one hand, the dwarf who was to be thrown as a projectile for the entertainment of others freely chose to participate. He was a free participant. On the other hand, being treated in this way might reasonably be thought by some to make the dwarf an object, simply used for the entertainment of others, a use that may be incompatible with belief in his equal personal dignity. So it's just not clear, really, that the abstract notion of autonomy will always provide the rationale that we're looking for. The other possible non-religious ground, which is roughly Hobbesian in character from Thomas Hobbes, is to accent our shared vulnerability. We're kind of equal sharers in vulnerability, and that makes us approximately equal sharers in a life that is, as Hobbes famously said, and everybody always quotes, a life that is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But an emphasis upon that shared frailty may create as many problems as it solves for us, grounded in a belief that death is the summum malum, the greatest evil, as Hobbes put it, the greatest evil to be avoided at all costs. It invites us to believe that to be compassionate is to do whatever is needed to relieve suffering, whatever sometimes will sustain and extend bodily life, or sometimes whatever will relieve us of our discontents and of that bodily life. And that is unlikely to be a road that really leads to belief in equal personal dignity. Although I myself think, that both of these approaches are defective, I'm not simply a critic here. I would be pleased and heartened if I thought that others in our society found one or the other of them persuasive, because that would at least provide them some ground, some rationale for the commitment to equal dignity which we claim to share, that commitment that needs a rationale. I simply doubt myself whether either of these grounds will prove to be adequate to the task. In particular, neither attempt to salvage the equal personal dignity of human beings can make suffering really intelligible. After all, we do not choose to suffer. It can have no point, purpose, or meaning for us as choosers. And on the other hand, a compassionate human being must sometimes simply hold it at arm's length and try to make it go away, or make the one who suffers it go away. We're left then still with a commitment in search of a rationale. Perhaps we should admire the straightforwardness with which Francis Fukuyama, in his fine book, Our Post-Human Future, searching for the ground of equal dignity, is forced finally to call it factor X. There must, he thinks, be some essential quality underlying all those other qualities that, alas, we share unequally. So we have to posit factor X to account for our equal dignity. Now you might ask, what is this mysterious factor X? Well, in the end, Fukuyama concludes that the answer must lie in the fact that evolution in producing human beings as complex, emergent systems has introduced qualitative change that cannot be accounted for in simple developmental terms by any set of characteristics. And so, he writes, factor X cannot be reduced to the possession of moral choice, or reason, or language, or sociability, or sentience, or emotions, or consciousness, or any other quality that has been put forth as a ground for human dignity. It is all of those qualities coming together in a human whole that make up factor X. Now, to me at least, Fukuyama is a very fine person, and sort of God bless him for positing factor X. But to me at least, that still sounds pretty much like a commitment in search of a rationale. It may not hurt, therefore, to try to call to mind what I think was once the Christian understanding of equal personal dignity, and I want to try to sort that out now, though you sort of have to like some abstract theology to do that, but we'll see what we can make of it. The idea of the equal dignity of persons, whatever the differences in their capacities, whatever their virtues or their vices, that idea is not a purely Christian or purely contemporary one. It's been around for a long time, although it's true that in the classical world of Greece and Rome, human dignity was most often probably an aristocratic concept, referring to those of high social standing or those marked by excellence of one sort or another. But there were thinkers, some Stoic thinkers, for instance, that did have an idea of a dignity that inhered in the individual, apart from, abstracted from particular characteristics or social roles. After all, two of the great Stoics were Epictetus, a slave, and Marcus Aurelius, an emperor, and in a certain sense, it didn't matter. Nor have Christian thinkers always clearly distinguished what I am calling personal dignity from what I am calling human dignity. For example, discussing the topic of murder and replying to an objection, as the structure of the Summa Theologiae calls for such replies, St. Thomas writes, "A man who sins deviates from the rational order and so loses his human dignity. To that extent he lapses into the subjection of the beasts." Now contrast that with the words of Pope John Paul II in the encyclical letter Evangelium Vitae, released in 1995, where it says, "Not even a murderer loses his personal dignity." Now, I'm sure there's a way to finesse the difference between those two statements, and there are people willing to work on it. I leave that finessing to others. It's at least worth seeing that Christians haven't always been as clear as we'd like. Nevertheless, that understanding of persons, that I quoted John Crosby, the philosopher, earlier, that understanding of persons as unrepeatable and non-interchangeable, characterized by an inner distance from themselves, that understanding has a history. It was, I think, Christian, Trinitarian, and Christological reflection that gave us the name for what we call persons. The gradually developed understanding of God as three persons in one being meant that the three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit, are numerically but not qualitatively distinct. They cannot be distinguished from each other by any properties they individually possess. You must remember the Athanasian Creed, or if you don't remember it, you must look it up. So if you call the Father Almighty, you must call the Son Almighty and the Spirit Almighty. If you call the Father Eternal, you must call the Son Eternal and the Spirit Eternal. They cannot be distinguished from each other by any properties that they possess. They are distinguished only by their relations to each other. The Father begets the Son. The Father does not beget the Spirit proceeds, and so forth. Only those relations distinguish them. Hence, the Son is not different from the Father, but other than the Father. When all is said and done, as the philosopher Robert Spemann wrote, it is a purely numerical distinction. And then as the Church simultaneously, or almost simultaneously, turned its attention to Christology, trying to figure out what it wanted to say about Jesus, it needed a way to describe Jesus that did not turn him into a kind of hybrid being, which was a great temptation. That is to say, it didn't think of him simply as two natures simply glued together. And the view that eventually carried the day was that that both natures of Jesus, divine and human, both natures were had by one person. So both natures with their respective properties were all had by the eternal Son of the Father. And the personal name Jesus refers not to a particular nature, but to the someone who bears both natures. Therefore, we are persons not because we share in the traits that characterize human nature. That is only what we are. A person is not just an instance or a specimen of humanity. We are persons because we exist in a particular way, characterized by unrepeatability and by an inner distance from the qualities of the nature that we share. In short, it was Christians trying to figure out how they ought to speak about Jesus and the God revealed in Jesus who developed the notion of a numerically distinct and unrepeatable person. They learned to distinguish what we have, our human nature, from who we are, our person. And the consequences of that have been incalculable, for that, I think, is the root of our notion of the equal and incommensurable dignity of persons. Now, if that is what it means, that we are persons sharing an equal dignity, then the question comes, the next obvious question in the progression of thought is, how shall we relate this concept of equal personal dignity to human dignity, the dignity that characterizes our nature, a dignity that marks the high status of our species, even while its distinguishing characteristics are distributed quite unevenly among the persons who are members of the species. So I want to try to think now for a moment about that relation between the two kinds of dignity. It is obvious that, at least in certain contexts and for certain purposes, we do make distinctions of merit and excellence among human beings. Academic institutions, for example, are meritocratic, or at least they once were. That may be up for grabs in the present time, but they certainly have been. And a class in which every student gets an A, even if welcomed for certain reasons by some students and, truth to tell, by some faculty, is understood to subvert the very nature of the undertaking. Likewise, the worlds of art and sport are arenas of performance in which we, quite different aspects of life, but in which we still strive for excellence and watch with an eye to discerning those whose performance is especially accomplished. We care about that. And we generally think, or at least we hope, if we're, observing a sporting event or listening to a musical performance or whatever, we generally hope that an eye for these distinctions and differences need not undercut our commitment to the equal dignity of each person. even when some of them sort of play the piano like I once did as a boy. And perhaps, which, I mean, that was the side that wasn't very good, didn't practice very much. And perhaps the differences need not undercut our understanding of equal personal dignity, but we have to be careful with that. We need to let our sense of these distinctions and excellence somehow be permeated by an eye for the dignity of the person. What might that mean? It's hard to say. I mean, the word permeated carries a lot there, but Kierkegaard makes the point beautifully, I think. And I'll read you a fairly long passage from Kierkegaard. Suppose, he writes, suppose there are two artists, and one of them says, I have traveled much and seen much in the world, but I have sought in vain to find a person worth painting. I have found no face that was the perfect image of beauty to such a degree that I could decide to sketch it. In every face I have seen one or another little defect, and therefore I seek in vain. Would this be a sign that this artist is a great artist? The other artist, however, says, and this is so Kierkegaard, the other artist says, well, I do not actually profess to be an artist. I have not traveled abroad either, but stay at home with the little circle of people who are closest to me, since I have not found one single face to be so insignificant or so faulted that I still could not discern a more beautiful side and discover something transfigured in it. That is why, without claiming to be an artist, I am happy in the art I practice and find it satisfying. Would this not be a sign that he is indeed the artist? He who, by bringing a certain something with him, found right on the spot what the well-traveled artist did not find anywhere in the world, perhaps because he did not bring a certain something with him. So the equal dignity of persons may not always seem obvious. It may be far from obvious. And perhaps we will see it, if we see it at all. Perhaps we will see it only insofar as we bring a certain something with us when we look. And for Kierkegaard, that certain something was very specifically the neighbor love that we are enjoined to show to every human being who is unrepeatably made for covenant community with God. And that neighbor love, echoing God's own love, underlies our commitment to equal personal dignity. Now, I myself doubt that there's really any way to derive a commitment to equal respect for every human being from the ordinary distinctions in merit and excellence that we all see in various aspects of life. I think there's no way to derive